Welcome back. I wanted to make sure that I had um, an opportunity to make video notes out of the community ecology number 2 because I know not everybody might have had them. So, in community ecology number 2 or part 2 notes, we're going to be looking at a few different things. The first thing we're going to look at is species diversity, or how many different species are in a community. We're going to talk about different ways to measure this and why it's important. We're also going to talk about the composition of a community, what it's made up of. So something like we'll talk about the dominant species or the species that is most abundant, has the highest total biomass. We'll look at the keystone species. This is the one that has an influence that's disproportionately great compared to the number of individuals in that community. And then we'll talk about how communities change over time or succession. So first we'll get to species diversity. And right away I want to be really clear, the reason that species diversity is important or biodiversity is important is because communities that have a greater diversity are more stable. They're more resistant to change, things like that. So, a greater biodiversity or species diversity offers more food sources, more different types of plants and animals that can be fed upon, more different habitats, more sources to find shelter, and like I was mentioning, more resilience in the face of environmental changes. So, for example, if a wildfire would come and threaten a community, one that had a higher species diversity would not only resist the fire, but also would bounce back much more quickly than one that hadn't been as diverse. Species diversity, though, can be measured in two different ways, and one is called species richness. Species richness. Now, species richness is just what is the number of different species in this given area. So for example, if you look at number 1, this picture up top, there are 4 different species, A, B, C, and D, in this given area. All right. If you look at the bottom picture, number 2, there are also 4 different species, A, B, C, and D, in that area. So the top picture and the bottom picture, if these were communities, have the same species richness score. There is another measure of species diversity called species evenness, which describes the proportion of each species found in a given environment. And the idea is that if the proportions are more balanced, it has a higher evenness score. So this species on the top, or sorry, this community on the top, community 1, would have a high species evenness score. Look, each of the 4 species makes up exactly 25%. On the other hand, community number 2 on the bottom would have a low species evenness score because species A, sorry, makes up 80% of the individuals in that community. Now, next time we're going to talk about something called the Shannon index, which is a way of calculating species diversity, which takes into account both factors, species richness and species evenness. Here you can see the examples or impacts of reduced biodiversity. So on the bottom here, this is a monoculture or a cornfield. All of the corn is basically genetically the same. It has a very, very, very low species richness and very, very low species evenness. And here is an old field. It has high species richness and pretty high species evenness. Look at all the different things you can see in this picture. So compare these communities. All right. Think about the Irish potato famine and the 1970 US corn crop failure. These things all had to do with agricultural monoculture, Reduced species diversity in both cases caused those crops to be susceptible to being completely destroyed by adverse weather conditions and climate changes or infection pathogens. More diverse communities like this, while some plants and animals might suffer or be killed off because of a pathogen or because of changes in climate, all of the organisms wouldn't, and we wouldn't end up with a complete um, reduction of biomass like happened in both of those situations because of a reduced biodiversity. One of the things I want to talk about now that has to do with the structure of a community are keystone species. Now, keystone species are different from dominant species. A dominant species is a species within a community that uh, is disproportionately large. So if we go back here, look in community number 2. Species A makes up 80% of the organisms in that community. It would be the dominant species. It makes up the greatest proportion of that community in terms of pure numbers, right? A keystone species is something different. It does not have to be the dominant species. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. More importantly, it is the species whose influence impacts the community much more strongly or to a greater extent than any of the others. It has an influential ecological role, or it exerts an important regulating effect on other species in the community. One important tie-in to what we just talked about is that keystone species increase the biodiversity in their habitat. So for example, here are some sea stars, and in their community, in the Washington Coast community, they are the keystone species. Now, if you look at an experiment over time with the number of species present, much greater species diversity with these sea stars present, the black line. Now compare it to the red line. As soon as we remove this keystone species, the diversity plummets. That's usually because keystone species work to open up other ecological niches or opportunities to gather resources that would not be there otherwise. Sea otters are another keystone predator in the North Pacific. All right, they have a regulatory role on stabilizing the sea urchin and the kelp populations. As soon as, for example, the orca whale population would grow too big and kill off too many of the sea otters, we would get a sea urchin and kelp biomass that would be highly unstable. Look at as soon as these orcas start eating off too many of these sea otters, the sea urchin population grows out of proportion, causing the kelp population to decline drastically, which means it's not available for other consumers to use. So keeping the sea otter population at sufficient numbers, it drastically influences the health of a lot of other species, namely sea urchin and kelps, within that population. There are many other examples of keystone species, and one that I want to bring up, as this dam alludes to, is beavers. The beaver is a keystone species in the Northeast and the West. There's a little picture of the beaver right there. Beavers build these dams, which transform the streams that they're found in to create new ponds and new microhabitats to allow many other organisms to flourish that normally would not fit into any of the available niches found within those streams. So removing the beavers removes the dams and transforms the community they live in so that it's much different than if they were present. Beavers influence a giant effect on their community, even though they might not be the dominant species. The last thing that I want to talk about today is called ecological succession. An ecological succession is a sequence of community changes over time that are predictable, meaning that they seem to occur again and again in similar communities. It's a timeline of transition of species from one composition to another. It might occur over years, over decades, over centuries, and usually begins or really happens quickly after disturbances, like in this picture. After the Mount St. Helens eruption, one could see over time succession, these changes happening really rapidly between this picture on the left and this picture on the right. Now, there are two different types of succession. Primary succession is changes which begin with virtually a lifeless area without any soil. So think after a volcanic eruption and all that lava and that magma cools and you've just got rock covering all of the old substrate. There's not even dirt to begin new plants growing. So the first step in primary succession is these organisms like bacteria, lichens, and mosses need to break down the rock and the gravelly substrate to start creating sand and sandy soil and finally soil that can have plants grow in it. After that has occurred to a certain degree, small grasses will start to grow, right? Grasses don't need a lot of soil nutrients and a great volume of substrate. And as they grow and die, they will add more biomass to the soil, more nutrients, such that small shrubs and woody plants can grow that need a little bit more nutrients and a little bit more substrate. And as they die and further enrich the soil, finally trees can grow. And this predictable pattern is an example of succession, of primary succession. Secondary succession, on the other hand, occurs when there is an existing community that was cleared, so most of the plants and organisms were removed, but there's still a base soil that's intact. So think after a field was clear cut, maybe in logging, excuse me, or a forest fire happened. Example on the left, burning releases nutrients formerly locked up in the tissues of trees, which return to the soil, which allow new plants and communities to begin. That's why in the Verona School Forest every year they burn the prairie. One reason, of course, is to keep that as a prairie so it doesn't continue through a succession. Otherwise, it just look like the school forest after a while. The second reason, though, is to unlock the nutrients, specifically nitrogen trapped in the biomass of the prairie community, and return it to the soil so that new plants can grow and to maintain a diverse community. So, most succession begins with some sort of disturbance, man-made or natural. Forest clearing by humans, a forest fire from a lightning strike, something like that. So, if we talk about the succession of species in terms of producers, primarily we begin with lichens and moss, like we mentioned. Then we move, which are called the pioneer species, the first ones that are able to start to grow and proliferate. Then we move to grasses that are able to compete well in high sunlit areas. There's not very many tall organisms or tall plants to shade them. We move on to bushes and small trees, which are more shade tolerant but can still grow well in open sunlight. And then we finish up with tall trees that are very shade tolerant. And when we reach this point, we've reached what's called a stable climax forest or climax community. At a climax community, we've reached equilibrium where we really won't see a lot of change until the next set of disturbances happen. Now, what you should realize, especially in unrestricted communities where humans don't have a large influence is as we go this way through succession, there is an increase in biomass. And an increase in biomass creates a higher propensity for that community to start on fire. And that's ultimately what resets a lot of these climax communities back to grasslands, burning. So, what causes succession? Well, one of the main things is tolerance. Early species, like those grasses and those lichens, are weedy or are selected, which means they proliferate like crazy. They spread like crazy, lots of seeds, and they have tolerance for very harsh conditions. Little soil with poor nutrients and a lot of sunlight, not very much shade. Their presence, though, facilitates habitat changes that necessitate more complex species to come. So those early lichens and mosses and bacteria and grasses change the soil pH, fertility, and light levels such that other species that are more complex can begin to live there and to proliferate. And those new species eventually outcompete those initial pioneer species. Eventually, when we reach a climax forest, the plant community is dominated by trees, very shade-tolerant trees with very little on the understory. It represents the final stage of natural succession for a specific location, and it's a stable plant community. It remains essentially unchanged in species composition as long as the site remains undisturbed. Meaning, if there isn't a fire or if there isn't another disaster which could reset, quote unquote, the community, it'll remain largely the same. And you will see these communities because they're dominated by birch and beech and maple and hemlock trees, oaks and hickories and pines. All right, very shade tolerant, very large, stable trees. Here are two pictures that might look familiar about climax forests. So the top one, the species mix of climax forests is dependent on the abiotic factors of the region. Very acidic soils, like in northern Wisconsin, are the reason that you get those, and rocky soils, those tall pine trees. And the more rich, loamy soils fertilized by the glaciers is why you get those deciduous forests more in the southern Wisconsin. So things like solar energy, temperature, rainfall, fertility and depth of the soil are all examples of abiotic factors that determine the species mix of a climax forest. So on the top, that's a taiga, and on the bottom, a temperate deciduous forest like we would have here in southern Wisconsin. Disturbances, like I said, though, are a natural cycle. So it's not a bad thing if a climax forest burns and restarts. It's a natural thing. And they often are necessary for communities to develop and to survive so that all of the nutrients and available resources aren't taken out of a community and it doesn't just collapse. So regular burning is a good thing as long as it happens more or less naturally and not because of someone's cigarette. They release nutrients, fires increase biodiversity, they make more new habitats, and they kind of rejuvenate and cleanse the community. All right, that's where I wanted to stop here for today. If you have any questions, please let me know either by email or by looking at our office hours. But otherwise, hopefully this makes sense, and I'll see you next time.